It is 7 o'clock. Good to see you this Monday morning. Genocide. That's how Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister views what's happening in her country. Overnight, fresh evidence of a fatal attack on a residential area in Kyiv. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, will be on the show shortly. Also, being able to update us on the rising numbers of COVID infections. Plus, with evidence suggesting Russian advances on Kyiv are stalling, we'll be talking to the former UK National Security Advisor, Peter Ricketts, and the first prosecutor of the UN Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, to ask whether Vladimir Putin will ever face a court. And they'll be speaking to the SNP's Ian Blackford, heading to Poland to bring back some young Ukrainian orphans to Scotland. It is Monday, the 21st of March. Civilian casualties. At least 4 people are killed as a shopping centre in the capital, Kyiv, is hit by Russian shells. The race to rescue. A hand is spotted amongst the rubble as firefighters pull people out alive from a destroyed building. We take you to the front line of the war in Kyiv, near Ukraine's border with Russia, with a special eyewitness report from our correspondent, John Sparks.
We're still inside the city, but it's a war zone, it's a battlefield. Tanks and heavy armaments just about everywhere.
The cost of living crisis. Sky News data reveals that 2.5 million families will be in fuel poverty in April. Amidst reports, the Chancellor may cut fuel duty. Boosting our chances against rising COVID cases. The spring programme to shore up our defences. Labour is to force an emergency vote in the Commons to demand that ferry company P&O reinstates 800 workers who were sacked without notice. Also ahead on the programme, shining a spotlight on the crisis, I'll be speaking to the stars AJ and Curtis Pritchard ahead of a major theatrical fundraiser for Ukraine. And banned in a bunker, we'll speak to the Ukrainians who are rallying the troops fighting in the streets above them. Morning all. Claims of genocide, a fresh attack on a residential part of the capital, and new intelligence suggesting the Russian advance on the capital is stalling. Certainly plenty to update you this morning on from Ukraine. At least 4 people have been killed by Russian shelling on a shopping centre in Kyiv. The latest MOD intelligence suggests that Russian forces advancing on the capital have stalled more than 25 kilometres from the centre of the city. Ukraine, well, it's rejected a Russian demand that its troops defending the besieged city of Mariupol lay down their weapons and leave. And both Ukraine's president and deputy prime minister have now accused Russia of genocide. Authorities in Sumy have reported an ammonia leak at a chemical plant and designated a hazardous zone 5 kilometres around the site. Well, let's look at what happened in Kyiv overnight. Russian shelling hitting homes and a shopping district, in the process killing at least 4 people. Security camera footage showed a huge explosion, followed by a series of smaller blasts at a shopping centre in the Podol district. Well, this is the moment that one man is rescued from the rubble by firefighters. His outstretched hand was spotted by emergency workers rushing to rescue people from the building. Well, let's speak now to our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, joining us now from Kyiv. Alex, good to see you this morning. We've just been reporting on that MOD intelligence briefing suggesting that the Russians are still stuck some 25 kilometres from the centre of the capital. But as the scene behind you reveals, they don't have to be there to destroy the place.
They definitely don't, and certainly nearer the centre, we're about 10 kilometres away from our centre. It feels very secure. People are definitely beginning to come back out onto the streets. Even shops and some restaurants are opening. They're planting flowers. They feel quite secure, I think, right in the centre. But even from where we were, we could hear the volley of explosions late last night. And if I could just step away and show you, there's a massive amount of devastation. And of course, not only is this a gym, a huge big shopping centre, it's also in the heart of an industrial area. And behind us and in front of this blast, there are residential homes and flats. Many of them have had their windows blown out and the fronts shattered. So, and we know, according to the police, so far there are about 4 confirmed deaths. The locals here and the people who are living all around, who are utterly terrified, we've been speaking to a few of them this morning, believe that the number of casualties could be much higher. And of course, it's not just the devastation it's causing, it's the absolute terrifying moments that you're going through when a volley of rockets and missiles are landing right next to you. People talk about it feeling like an earthquake. They're absolutely terrified, even if they're not actually caught up and hurt themselves. They're very scared. So Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, is giving a very defiant message and saying that they're never going to give in, but there's a lot of terror once again on the streets of Kyiv.
Alex, many thanks. We're joined in the studio now once again by the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid. Minister, great to have you on the programme. Let's just reflect, of course, plenty to talk about in terms of your brief, but let's reflect on what we have seen coming out of Ukraine over the past 24 hours. I personally have watched more footage from Ukraine than I would care to ever admit to. But this weekend, seeing children being pulled out of the rubble kind of brought it home to me. Is the British government yet at a point where they can join the Ukrainian President, Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister, in describing what we're seeing in Ukraine as a genocide?
Look, like everyone, I'm appalled by the scenes coming out of Ukraine right now, the despicable attacks on civilians. When I was last in your studio, that was the day we saw the picture of the woman from a maternity hospital, a pregnant woman that had been murdered by the Russians, and now we're seeing children being pulled out of rubble. It's in terms of holding Russia accountable. I mean, Russia and the President Putin, he will absolutely be held accountable for this. There's an international criminal court that will work on this, and they're already compiling evidence. The Deputy Prime Minister was in The Hague last week, offering the UK's full support to hold Russia to account. In the meantime, we will, of course, will continue to support the Ukrainians in every single way that we can.
I do wonder, though, we heard from the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown at the weekend pointing out the problems that there may well be with the International Criminal Court process, not least of which is there's not a chance that we're going to be able to extradite Vladimir Putin from Russia to face charges directly. What do you make of his suggestion that there is perhaps a Nuremberg-style trial set up to try and prosecute this, which we can prosecute in absentia if necessary?
Look, I think all of that should be looked at. I think it's right that Gordon Brown and others, many people are thinking about what ways and mechanisms can the international community use to hold Russia to account. I mean, right here and now, I think it's really important that we and our allies continue to support Russia, support Ukraine in every way with the military aid that we're providing. I think more than any other country, the humanitarian support that we're providing as well. All of this is crucial, but also making sure that Russia is held to account.
I understand that this is not your brief. I understand that they're all cabinet ministers will want to be careful with their language, but I will note that you don't feel comfortable going as far as the Ukrainian president and being literal about this, stating that in your view, given what we have seen, you feel that he is committing acts of genocide.
What President Zelensky thinks is very, very important to us. We, of course, will listen to him carefully. The Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, talks to him on a regular basis, and we will help the Ukrainians gather all the evidence they need for successful prosecutions whenever we can.
Where are we at the moment with the scheme to rehouse Ukrainians coming to the United Kingdom? 3.4 million people have fled the country at the moment, and the concerns are, particularly from agencies working in non-governmental organisations working in this field, is that we're not being quick enough to match people up.
Well, my understanding is with this, so there's two schemes at the moment. With the family reunification scheme, I think some 9,500 visas have been issued. With the hosting a Ukrainian family scheme, I think some over 150,000 people have registered their interest, and the process of matching those hosts with families from Ukraine has begun.
Can I just ask you about something that the Home Secretary mentioned at the weekend, which I haven't really seen picked up particularly widely? We know that we have had a different approach as regards visas for Ukrainians coming to this country. She said this: the truth is that a very small number of people can wreak utter havoc, and Russia has a history of covert hostile activity. Are we really suggesting that we believe that there could be Russian agents coming to this country under false Ukrainian passports?
That's what the Home Secretary is suggesting, and she's right to, by the way, to point that out.
To what end would Russian agents be coming in that fashion?
We know the Russians have done that. They did it in 2018 when I had her job. And we saw in our country Russian agents came here with a deadly nerve agent, a chemical weapon, and they used it in Salisbury. We know it killed people, and Russia was directly responsible for that. They infiltrated our country with agents, with a chemical weapon, and used it. And so it is right that there are some level of security checks. We also know that extremists and extremist organisations operate in that region. Of course, the level of security checks has to be proportionate to the issues that we're dealing with.
The example that you gave,
at the same time, it mustn't get in the way of letting Ukrainians come here to safety.
Sure, but the example that you gave of Salisbury, my understanding is those two Russians arrived on a Russian passport on a tourist visa. In what way would these security checks stop them coming?
Well, it wouldn't make sense to get into detail about how our checks work precisely. But I think most people would understand that we do what we can to protect our homeland.
You've been very good, so let's talk on speaking away from your brief, so let's move on to it. COVID cases are clearly on the upswing at the moment. Do you have an estimate of when we might reach the peak?
I think with Omicron, we're past the peak now. We've come down from that level. Although infections are rising, case numbers are rising, and hospitalisations have risen a bit as well in the last 2 weeks, they're still way below their peak. It's also worth sort of keeping in mind why we're seeing rises. That was always going to be the case when we opened up, and also we have a subvariant, let's call it, of the original Omicron called BA2, which we know on the one hand is more infectious than the original Omicron variant, but thankfully these vaccines that we have are just as effective against it.
Why is it taking so long to get to this next stage of the rollout? By my reckoning, we're about 6 months away from the start of the third dose scheme, and we know, of course, that resistance wanes a lot quicker than within 6 months. Should we perhaps have got to this point slightly quicker, or is it all because of the JCVI?
No, I think we're exactly at the right place. And so when it comes to vaccine waning and effectiveness, it's something we monitor almost on a daily basis. I think as a country, we've probably done more research on that than any other country.
But isn't waning resistance part of the reason why we are seeing increased infections, increased hospitalizations?
I think the primary reasons are the ones I mentioned, which are increased social mixing, and also this BA2 subvariant. The announcement today, which is a spring booster dose for those that are over 75, elderly people living in care homes and the immunosuppressed. This will allow that group of people, which are at more serious risk than others, to top up their protection against this virus and give them that extra level of confidence that they need. Is
it not somewhat counterintuitive at a point at which we're suggesting that over 75s, people who are vulnerable should be able to get a fourth dose, that we're about a fortnight away from the ending of free COVID testing?
No, I don't think the two things are necessarily related. I mean,
Do you not think that if you remove free testing, fewer people will test?
Well, obviously, if there's fewer tests around, then fewer will be used. But the question really is, do we still need to have a universal free testing offer, which is, as it sounds, it's for everyone whenever they want to test? And our determination, based on the advice that we receive, is that is no longer necessary. We're in a much better stage with COVID than we have been so far. Clearly, it's still there. That's why we still need to keep focusing on our defences. But the best defence is vaccination. We've built a wall of defence. It's working. In fact, I think this weekend, the UK Health Security Agency, they said in their analysis that since December, because of the booster push that we had, we've kept some 157,000 people out of hospital. So vaccines work, and that is why everyone that's eligible, please, should come forward.
Just briefly, should we expect a broader rollout of a fourth dose?
Well, the JCVI, that's our group of independent advisors, they have said they are looking at an autumn dose for over 50s, but there's no final decision at this point in time.
Can we just reflect, just briefly, going back to Ukraine, on the comments that the Prime Minister made at the weekend, drawing a comparison in his mind between voting to leave the European Union and fighting against a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Did you think it was appropriate? He seemed to suggest that those who didn't vote against Brexit, like yourself, were somehow not lovers of freedom.
I heard his comments, and I don't think he was suggesting that at all. What I heard from the Prime Minister was basically the desire for self-determination in everyone, no matter what country they're in, no matter what their circumstance, is strong. I don't think in any way he was connecting the situations in Ukraine and the UK. And if we want to know what the Prime Minister thinks about Ukraine and responding, I mean, we can see for ourselves in terms of the support that he's provided, rock-solid support compared to any other world leader. You
don't think it was at all crass for the Prime Minister to make that comparison or to allude to a comparison? I mean, the Prime Minister...
I don't accept that he was comparing UK and
He mentioned
Ukraine.
One and he mentioned the other in the same point.
His point was about the importance of self-determination and people, whoever they are, wherever they are, they have this strong feeling of wanting to have freedom and determine.
I'm just gently suggesting that the self-determination, shown by the Brits who voted to leave a political and economic union is not the same as the self-determination shown by people who are picking up guns and firing on invaders.
And he wasn't saying... I think it's spurious to say that he was connecting somehow UK and Ukraine in that way. Well, I think most normal people listening to that wouldn't have drawn that conclusion. I think you can see what he's talking about, which is just about the importance of self-determination.
Just a final point, of course, on all eyes this week on what the Chancellor does come Wednesday, and you, I'm sure, will not be drawn on perhaps more money for you or whatever else. But just in terms of the strategy, currently, isn't the single biggest beneficiary of the rise in the cost of living right now the Treasury, that any wiggle room that the Treasury has right now is down to increased tax take at the petrol pumps, VAT and so on?
Well, look, one of the benefits of no longer being Chancellor is I don't really have to answer those questions.
Sajid Javid, we'll leave it there. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, and the war in Ukraine is, of course, dominating the front pages of the papers once again. Here is the Telegraph. It reports on accusations that Vladimir Putin has ordered the abduction of thousands of Ukrainians from Mariupol, forcing them, deporting them to remote Russian cities, in fact. The Guardian, also leading with that, the US ambassador to the UN, saying that if those reports are true, then it's disturbing and unconscionable. The Times describes the abduction of civilians with the headline, Russia accused of genocide. Here is the Mirror. It reports on the deadline for P&O bosses to explain the decision to sack 800 workers. Now, Ukraine has accused Russia of committing acts of genocide. It follows the bombing of an art school in Mariupol, where 400 people, mostly women and children, had taken refuge. And in a further sign of just how attritional the battle for the country's major cities is becoming, Russian-backed separatists said that they had used devastating so-called vacuum bombs to try and break the deadlock. But there are signs that in some places, the two sides are fighting themselves towards a standstill. The city of Kyiv, just a short drive from the border with Russia, certainly bears the scars of vicious fighting, but also some signs of a stalemate. Our correspondent John Sparks travelled with the Ukrainian military to the front line on the outskirts of Kyiv. Just a warning, this report does contain pictures of the bodies of Russian soldiers.
The most desirable homes in the city of Kharkiv are located within its northern suburbs. But no one comes here now unless you man a checkpoint or carry a weapon or drive a T-72 tank. On the outskirts of the country's second largest city, the Ukrainians and the Russians take potshots in the woods as the Ukrainian army awaits the enemy's next move. We're still inside the city, but it's a war zone. It's a battlefield. Tanks and heavy armaments just about everywhere. We were given access to this suburban frontier and taken to a children's camp in the trees with mock turrets and cabins and areas to play.
Ну, выстрелы хаотично. Там упадет, туда прилетит, туда прилетит.
Shells have pierced the grounds and a rocket hit the door. Our guide did not want to show his face. It's actually punctured the door around here, the rocket. Inserted itself through the metal frame. Nearby, we found a soldier called Doc. He'd been planting landmines when the shells came in. What did you see? What did you experience?
Во-первых, страшно было, конечно. А так, грохот, ну, подвал помех, конечно. Ну, я словами не можу передати вам, що я чувствував на той момент. Страх за сім'ю.
Garwin, we've got to go in. A few minutes later, we had to use his shelter.
Go.
Grad rockets incoming. The signs of war are all around, with the remnants of a Russian column littering the trees. It's a sign of what the Ukrainian army is able to achieve. In the suburbs of Kyiv, the Russian advance has ground to a halt. And in a gruesome display of grit and intent, we were taken to see the bodies of 5 dead Russian servicemen. A Ukrainian captain claiming the Russians have refused to repatriate the bodies. The battle may have stalled, but it certainly isn't over. Everyone in this city is sure of that. So they prepare themselves for the seemingly inevitable, regardless of the personal cost. John Sparks, Sky News in Kyiv.
And we will have more from John Sparks and indeed Mark Stone on the Polish border throughout the programme this morning. But just a little bit of breaking news. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, talking about the crisis in Ukraine, says this: the Chinese Red Cross is to offer an additional 10 million yuan of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Plenty of discussion in diplomatic circles at the moment as to how to leverage China's relationship with the Kremlin. But stay where you are. Plenty still to come on the programme this morning as Russia's advance on Ukraine's cities appears to be stalling. I'll be speaking to the former UK National Security Advisor, Peter Ricketts. I'll also be joined by the first prosecutor of the UN Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, Judge Richard Goldstone. And as fuel prices skyrocket, I'll be speaking to the Executive Director of the Petrol Retailers Association. Sky News can reveal that 2.5 million families will be in fuel poverty when the new energy price cap comes into effect at the start of April. A family is deemed to be in fuel poverty if more than 10% of its income is spent on those bills. Well, since February of last year, the annual price of a standard energy tariff has increased by more than £800 to almost £2,000. Areas in the West and East Midlands and London are the worst affected. Some 40% of households in these parts are likely to experience fuel poverty. In Scotland, meanwhile, more than 900,000 households are also expected to be fuel poor under the new cap, with 2/3 of them in extreme fuel poverty. Sky's Milena Veselinovic has been taking a look at the numbers and joins us now from the newsroom. Good to see you this morning, Milena. It's all very concerning, all very worrying, but particularly the figures. Millions of people are going to be struggling very, very soon.
Good morning, Neil. Very concerning. Overall, the figures show that a quarter of people in England are going to be fuel poor as of Friday after next, when the cost of a standard bill will rise by 50%. And now that's 15 million people. And Sky News analysis has shown that the worst place in the country is going to be Bushbury and Low Hill area of Wolverhampton, where up to 9 in 10 people will be fuel poor. And that's particularly concerning when you look at medical research by the British Medical Journal, which clearly links children growing up in damn cold homes with poor health outcomes. Now, in Scotland, the situation is also going to be very dire. Shows that 40% of households there will be fuel poor, and 2/3 of that number are expected to be in extreme fuel poverty, and that means they're spending 20% of their income on energy. Now, the government has announced plans to try to help this situation, some loans, some rebates, but all eyes are now on Chancellor Rishi Sunak and what he'll say in his spring statement.
Milena, thank you. And we will, of course, have live coverage of the Chancellor's spring statement. That's due on Wednesday. We'll be starting our coverage from 11 o'clock here on Sky News. Also making the news this morning, Labour is expected to force an emergency vote to ban fire and rehire practices and to demand that the ferry company P&O take back their workforce. The mass sackings without notice have caused outrage nationwide, amidst reports that security firms with balaclavas and handcuffs were used to take sacked British workers off the vessels. The Foreign Office says that Murat Tabaz, who holds British, US and Iranian citizenship, is now at a hotel in Tehran, having been freed from jail last week at the same time as Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Shuri. Mr Tabaz was not able to leave the country with the other 2 detainees. The Foreign Office say they're working hard to get Mr Tabaz back to the UK. 2 men have died whilst queuing for 4 hours for fuel in Sri Lanka as the country reckons with the most severe economic crisis in its history. Supply shortages on the island have also caused millions of school exams to be cancelled due to a lack of paper. The International Monetary Fund has indicated that it would be willing to discuss a financial bailout for the nation. Smacking children is now illegal in Wales. The new law means that children now have the same protection from physical violence as adults, and that anyone looking after a child can now face charges if they're found to have physically disciplined them. Smacking children is already illegal in Scotland, and child protection charities are now calling for the same measures to be introduced in England. And in the next hour, I'll be speaking to Wales Deputy Minister for Social Services, Julie Morgan. Now, the Royals Caribbean tour didn't exactly start out as planned after villagers in Belize refused to let them onto their land. But then we had this. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge managed, oh dear, to get the spring back in their step quickly enough. William and Kate, as you can see, actually, I think Kate's rather better than the future king. Well, they danced with local school children, rolled cocoa beans, and were welcomed by local families on the second day of their visit. But as the Russian invasion continues, Ukrainians are finding new ways to be heard and appeal for international support. The Ukrainian punk band Beton have put their own twist on the Clash's London Calling. Proceeds from their war anthem Kyiv Calling, recorded near the front line, will help fund an alert system to warn the population of threats and lobby for international support. Kyiv calling. Kyiv calling. I never felt so much like I think that will do quite well. But let's take you through some of the best pictures making the morning's papers. And we start with The Express. The Great Escape. The Express reporting on a man who has dug, by hand, a tunnel to his garden shed. It's steel reinforced, fully lit and carpeted, and it took 3 years to complete. Colin Fursey acknowledged it would be quicker to walk to his shed, but said it was more fun to use the tunnel, particularly if it rains. back. Just a reminder as to our top stories this hour, and at least 4 people have been killed as a shopping centre in the capital, Kyiv, is hit by Russian shelling. A hand is spotted amongst the rubble as firefighters pull people out alive from a destroyed building. And Sky News data reveals that 2.5 million families will be in fuel poverty in April. Amidst reports the Chancellor may well cut fuel duty. Now, just a short time ago, I asked the Health Secretary if he agreed with the Ukrainian leadership that Russia is committing genocide, and whether or not he supported the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown's calls for an international Nuremberg-style tribunal for Vladimir Putin.
In terms of holding Russia accountable, Russia and the President Putin, he will absolutely be held accountable for this. There's an international criminal court that will work on this, and they're already compiling evidence. The Deputy Prime Minister was in The Hague last week offering the UK's full support to hold Russia to account. I think it's right that Gordon Brown and others, many people are thinking about what ways and mechanisms can the international community use to hold Russia to account. I mean, right here and now, I think it's really important that we and our allies continue to support Russia, support Ukraine in every way with the military aid that we're providing.
As you can see, our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, is here with us. Good to see you, Tamara. What did we make of that which we heard from the Health Secretary there? He's in a bit of a difficult position. It's not his brief, but given what we're seeing in Ukraine, it's becoming very obvious that there is a line in terms of the language the government does not want to cross.
Yes, absolutely. What words can we use to describe the absolute horrors that we've seen and in some cases only heard about from the city of Mariupol and elsewhere in Ukraine? Not genocide, according to the Health Secretary. We've seen British politicians, including the Prime Minister, being willing to use words like war crimes being committed. It's always been the government's position that genocide is a decision for international courts, which I think accounts for their reticence there. It is usually an international court's decision to describe a genocide as having happened. There's a UN convention dating back to the 1940s on that. But because it has always been very difficult and a very long process to get the International Criminal Court in The Hague to actually determine something as a genocide. I think there have only been 3 that they've ever determined, including Bosnia.
And they took a long time to get to that point.
Indeed, and a lot of other, obviously, very strong contenders that other people have called genocides. That's why you're seeing the likes of Gordon Brown and, interestingly, John Major as well backed this call that if you can't get the International Criminal Court, which the UK is trying very hard to do, Dominic Raab was there last week talking to them about getting them to examine the evidence, perhaps you could have some other kind of hearing to try and bring Russia to account, because the scenes that we're seeing on our screens at the moment, people want to see someone brought to account. But even when a genocide is determined, it can be very difficult for those who committed it to then be put into prison.
Certainly can. Tamara, for now, thanks very much indeed. Russian forces advancing on Kyiv from the northeast have stalled. The latest defence intelligence report from the Ministry of Defence says that the bulk of Russian forces remain more than 25 kilometres from the centre of the city. Joining us once again on the programme, Peter Ricketts, former Permanent Under-Secretary from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, also National Security Advisor. Frankly, your CV goes on, Peter, so we'll leave it there. But I wonder if we could start our conversation this morning with the topic that I was just discussing with Tamara. In terms of the language being used by the government, you know, sorry used to be the hardest word. For this government, genocide and war criminal. Why have they made that decision?
I don't know why they've made that decision. I mean, it is, as your correspondent said, a decision for international courts whether the legal test of a genocide has been passed. I'm not a lawyer, and I can't tell you whether that's the case. But it's clear to me that war crimes are being committed, crimes against humanity, which is another of the definitions that the International Criminal Court look at. The advantage of the International Criminal Court is that it exists, it is set up, the prosecutor is, as I understand it, already collecting the evidence, and it's vital that he has all the evidence he needs. How exactly these crimes are going to be prosecuted in the future, you know, I don't think it's clear now, but let's make sure we have all the evidence so that a future court can decide how exactly the crimes that are being committed should be described in legal terms.
Peter, given what we are seeing at the moment on the ground in Ukraine, the encircling of Kyiv, yes, the advance is stalled, but they're shelling the city, to destruction at the moment. Given what we've seen in Mariupol, do you have any confidence that there is a diplomatic solution to the war?
No, I don't, to be absolutely honest, certainly not in the foreseeable future. I think it's clear the Russians cannot win an outright victory. Ukrainian resistance has been far too strong for that. We've seen even in Mariupol, after weeks and weeks of smashing that city to pieces, people are not ready to surrender to Russian forces. How much more difficult would that be in a massive city like Kyiv? They are clearly stalled, bogged down, all kinds of problems with their logistics. I don't think that they are ready yet to declare any kind of a ceasefire negotiation. The positions of the two sides are far too far apart for that. I fear we're headed for a long, grinding campaign where the Russians try and smash one town after another in the hope of breaking the will of the Ukrainian people. I think we're in for a stalemate rather than a negotiated solution.
As our viewers can see on the bottom of the screen at the moment, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has announced additional funding for humanitarian purposes in Ukraine, which I'm sure will be warmly received. But in terms of the relationship that the Chinese have with this conflict, do you detect any sign that they are willing to use their influence over the Kremlin to try and bring about a speedier end to this? Or are they just in a holding pattern, a wait-and-see situation for them?
I think they are, as usual, just looking out for their own interests, frankly. It quite suits them for the Americans and the Europeans to be tied down in the east of Europe, for the Russians to be in difficulties, puts them more and more at China's mercy in terms of a more dependent relationship with China. I think China is looking to see how it can come out of this best. It doesn't want to get too close to Putin in case Putin fails massively, which would tarnish the Chinese president. So, yes, they're holding back humanitarian aid. They will make gestures to show that they're not happy with an invasion of an independent country. But if the Russians and the West bog down in a long war, China will probably see in a cynical way that that rather suits them and their drive for the dominant power in nature in the future.
I mean, clearly, our defence budget, our standing in the world, means that we do have a role to play in trying to sort out the situation in Ukraine. I'm just wondering, though, how much influence we really have. I understand the Prime Minister is off to the NATO summit on Thursday, but he's not been invited, unlike Joe Biden, to the EU Leaders Summit on the same day.
Well, in a way, I don't think that's very surprising. I mean, given the sort of remarks he's been making over the weekend about comparing Brexit to the struggle of the Ukrainian people, I mean, that was seen as desperately insulting and insensitive all around Europe. I'm afraid we are not going to be helping to shape the agenda with our EU counterparts. We should be. NATO is an important forum for Britain. As you say, we're a major defence spender. The UK has been very effective in supplying aid and support to the Ukrainians. But in the crucial discussions that will go on between Joe Biden and the Europeans, for example, on strengthening sanctions, Britain is going to be on the sidelines of that, which I think is a great mistake. I think the Prime Minister ought to be reaching out and working to improve relations, to heal the wounds of the past with the EU, not doubling down on them.
So, given what we are seeing in terms of the response, you think the Prime Minister was speaking in crass terms, was speaking in insulting terms? I just had the Health Secretary on the programme this morning. Sophie Ridge had the Chancellor on yesterday, both of whom saying, look, move away, nothing to see here. He didn't make a direct comparison. They might have been watching a different speech, but it certainly looked that way to me.
The Prime Minister ought to be leading the nation towards unity in this moment of serious crisis in Europe. He ought to be healing the wounds of the Brexit debates. With Europe, he ought to be rebuilding bridges. But it managed to be insulting and insensitive, I'm afraid. I think the best thing he could do would be to withdraw the remark and get back to working in a sensible, constructive way with the Europeans, who are not some sort of authoritarian force from which Britain sought its freedom. They are our partners and our allies in confronting this massive threat to the security of all of us in Central Europe.
Peter, great to have you on the programme as always. Lord Peter Ricketts there. Thank you for joining us. Now, Ukraine has, as we've been mentioning, accused Russia of committing genocide following the sustained bombing of the port city of Mariupol. Joining us now, the former UN Chief Prosecutor for the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, Richard Goldstone. Richard, great to have your expertise on the programme this morning.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if we can just start with a very, very general question. Given your experience of what took place in the former Yugoslavia and indeed in Rwanda, looking at what you have seen emerge from Ukraine over the past 4 weeks, is there a prima facie case of war crimes having been committed?
Well, obviously there are distinctions. One has to look at each situation of war crimes and each war separately and on its own merits. The word genocide, in my view, unfortunately, is too easily bandied about. Genocide is defined very clearly as the intent. It requires a special intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a racial or ethnic or religious group. The evidence in the former, the evidence in Ukraine, in my view, clearly has strong evidence of the most serious war crimes and probably crimes against humanity being committed by the Russian forces. But certainly, whether there's the intent on the part of President Putin and the Russian leaders to destroy the Ukrainian people is a very different question from the sorts of attacks we are seeing. In fairness, it must be said too that Russia was the first to bandy about the word genocide. Russia has sought to justify its attack on the fact that genocide is allegedly being committed by the Ukrainians against Russian speakers in the northern parts of Ukraine. That was taken by the Ukraine government to the International Court of Justice, the highest UN court in The Hague. And that court came to the conclusion that there was some evidence that Russia was misusing the word genocide as a false premise, as a false reason for the attack. And the court issued preliminary ruling calling upon Russia to immediately halt the attack and withdraw its forces. So that's where we are at the present time.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, then? Obviously, as you've alluded to, the International Criminal Court preparing a case currently. There are those, however, including the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who suggest that the ICC might not be the best way of dealing with these alleged war crimes, instead perhaps setting up a tribunal. What is your view on that?
No, I don't think former Prime Minister Gordon Brown is questioning the capacity or the efficiency of the International Criminal Court or its jurisdiction to bring cases and to investigate and bring prosecutions against Russian leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The issue the former Prime Minister, and I support it, has been involved with is that the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over aggression, over the crime of aggression being committed by Russia. The crime of aggression is an attack contrary to the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations to use military force without the consent of the Security Council or in self-defense. And Russia's defense of genocide is the issue, as I've said, has been taken to the International Court of Justice. But what is needed is another tribunal side by side with the ICC that is limited to dealing with the crime of aggression only. That was done in Nuremberg, where the four victorious nations set up the Nuremberg trial and successfully brought cases against the Nazi leaders of aggression, or it was called then crimes against peace. So there's no question here of second guessing or in any way diminishing the important role of the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The issue is aggression.
Rishi Sunak has fuelled hopes he'll slash petrol duty when he delivers his mini-budget this week. The rising fuel costs compound a growing cost of living catastrophe as rocketing inflation is tipped to hit 8% within weeks. And, of course, national insurance heading for a hike just next month. Joining us now on the programme, the Executive Director of the Petrol Retailers Association, Gordon Balmer. Gordon, good to see you this morning. I wonder if you had the same look on your face as I did when you last went to the petrol pumps. It is getting eye-watering, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. And we do recognise that we don't want to charge these sort of prices for our customers. Many of our members know their customers personally, so it's not great news at the moment, I'm afraid.
How can you just give us a comparison with other kind of comparable countries across the rest of Europe? We talk often about how the Chancellor has held fuel duty, frozen fuel duty for some time, but actually, given where it stands as an international comparison, isn't the Treasury doing quite well out of all of this?
Well, obviously, with prices where they are at the moment, they charge 57.95 pence per litre on duty, but then they also tax that as well with an additional 20% of VAT. So, yes, from the beginning of the year, as we've seen prices escalate, obviously there's been extra VAT revenue returned to the Exchequer. So, yes, they have made money out of it.
Do you think that we could, at any point in the not-too-distant future, see £2 a litre?
Well, it depends. I mean, we've seen increases of $180 a day on the price of diesel and obviously similar on petrol in terms of wholesale prices. So it could, depending upon circumstances that are going on in the rest of the world, it could go up to that level. We hope not, but it's obviously very hard to predict at the moment.
So what then do you want to hear from the Chancellor come Wednesday? Suggestions we could see 5 pence coming off of fuel duty, but by my ready reckoner, that would be, what, a couple of quid on a tank?
Yeah, well, we've written to the Chancellor on a number of occasions, in fact, 3 times, urging him to cut VAT and fuel duty. We've obviously seen what other governments around the world have done, particularly our counterparts in Southern Ireland, with 17 pence off of their duty for petrol and about 13 pence off for diesel. So 5 pence is not as great as what the Irish government have done. The French have done it as well, the Dutch government. So we've seen governments try and alleviate this situation, and we're urging the Chancellor to do what he can.
Gordon Balmer from the Petrol Retailers Association. Great to have you on the show this morning. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, Ukraine has been using social media extremely effectively throughout the Russian invasion, but now they've been lent a helping hand and a left foot.
Hi everyone, so I'm handing over my social media to Irina, the head of the Regional Perinatal Centre in Kyiv, Ukraine.
David Beckham handed control of his Instagram account to a Ukrainian doctor working in Kyiv yesterday to raise awareness of the conditions there. He wants to use his account for 71.4 million Instagram followers to highlight the amazing work of medical staff.